What if there was once a civilization more powerful than Egypt, and it vanished in a single night? And what if this is not a legend, but a genuine memory of humanity? Atlantis, merely an invention of Plato or a reflection of ourselves? For millennia, between the crashing of waves and the salty breath of the sea, people have told of a lost island, a place more resplendent than any empire, swallowed by the ocean in one fateful night. They say golden palaces stood there, ringed walls that enclosed the land like the fingerprints of the sea god Poseidon, and canals that shimmered like liquid light between sky and water. And when the earth and sea trembled, everything sank, only the memory remained. The world has changed. Yet this question has never been laid to rest. From the Greek philosophers of antiquity to modern scientists, from divers searching for ancient stones in the sea to engineers surveying the ocean with sonar, all are driven by the same thought. Did Atlantis really exist? Or was it a warning that every civilization, even ours, is fragile when hubris and power lose their measure? This journey is more than the search for a sunken island. It is a search for ourselves, for what drives us to dream, to believe, and to remember. Why do we long so much for our origins? Why do we need myths to understand ourselves? In the next 60 minutes, we will follow Plato's traces from Athens to islands buried under volcanic ash, from the Atlantic to the depths of the Amazon. We will encounter cultures that once bloomed and then sank into silence. And perhaps, somewhere among all the ruins, we will recognize the true face of Atlantis, the reflection of humanity itself. Let us begin with the first story where it all originated. Plato and the legend of the island that disappeared in a night. If one imagines Athens in the 4th century BC, the air smells of dust and olive wood. The agora echoes with the disputes of orators, and moving through the narrow alleys is a young man who asks more questions than he gives answers. Plato. He was born in the year 427 BC into a noble family closely connected to the political elite of Athens. Yet his time was not an era of peace, but one of upheaval. The city had just lost the Peloponnesian War. Faith in democracy was weakened, and many saw philosophy as the last place where one could reflect on justice, moderation, and the good. Plato was a student of Socrates, the man who taught that knowledge begins with the insight into one's own ignorance. When Socrates was executed in 399 BC, this event shook Plato deeply. It was a sign for him that the democracy which preached freedom could simultaneously condemn the innocent. In this experience, his resolve matured to seek the truth not in the speeches of politicians, but in philosophy itself. In his numerous dialogues, from Politeia via Phaedrus to Timaeus and Critias, Plato designed a world in which ideas are the foundation of reality. He sought the ideal state, a society founded on reason and virtue, and exactly in this context, the story of Atlantis appears for the first time. In Timaeus and Critias, 2 dialogues he wrote towards the end of his life, he tells of an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, meaning west of the Strait of Gibraltar, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined. Atlantis was not a geographical description for him, but a moral parable. He depicted an empire of supreme wealth, divine origin, and technical mastery, which nevertheless perished in its own arrogance. The inhabitants were descendants of the sea god Poseidon. They lived initially in harmony with divine laws, but with growing prosperity came hubris. People wanted more: power, fame, conquest. And so Plato had the gods decide to wipe this civilization from the earth in a single night and day. The philosopher used fable to teach his contemporaries a lesson. While Athens suffered from corruption, greed, and political chaos after the war, he painted the picture of a society breaking apart from the same errors. Atlantis was the reflection of his homeland, a warning symbol of the loss of measure and ethics. Yet beyond this moral dimension remained a residual mystery. Why did Plato choose a distant sunken island to convey his message? Perhaps because the sea was for him the unconscious of humanity, deep, mysterious, unpredictable. And perhaps because he knew that myths live longer than political systems. So Atlantis became not only a philosophical parable, but an echo that reverberates through the millennia. And this echo leads us further from Plato's academy out into the world, to where the history of its transmission begins, a trail leading from the priests of Egypt to the scholars of Athens. If Plato tells of Atlantis in his dialogues, he speaks not of an inspiration, but of a story that he claimed was far older than Athens itself. In Timaeus and Critias, he puts this narrative into the mouth of his great-grandfather Critias, who in turn is said to have heard it from the famous Athenian lawmaker Solon. Thus, Plato linked his philosophy with a heritage that allegedly originated in distant Egypt, from the temples of Sais in the western Nile Delta. Solon, who lived in the 6th century BC, is considered one of the 7 sages in Greek history. He reformed the laws of Athens, tried to alleviate social tensions, and later, exhausted by political life, traveled through the eastern Mediterranean. On one of these journeys, Plato reports, Solon was received in Egypt by priests who preserved ancient records of great floods, sunken empires, and forgotten peoples. One of these priests is said to have told him that the Greeks were like children because they had forgotten their oldest history. In the Egyptian archives, however, events were recorded that went back 9,000 years. Among them was the memory of a mighty island empire that lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules and sank in a night through earthquakes and floods. Historically, Solon's journey cannot be fully verified. Yet the core of this narrative fits a widespread ancient motif, the cultural memory of Egypt as a source of ancient knowledge. Even Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described Egypt as the land that taught humanity counting the stars and history. For Plato, this image of ideal order and lasting memory was fascinating, the exact counterpart to Greece, where war and change prevailed. By introducing Atlantis to the world through Egypt, he lent the story an aura of authority and timelessness. The idea that knowledge was passed down over millennia through priests, writings, and oral tradition was deeply rooted in antiquity. Plato used this motif to show that morality and memory are inextricably linked. He who forgets his past also loses the compass for the future. In this respect, the tale of Atlantis is not just a myth about downfall, but also an allegory about forgetting, a theme that runs like a red thread through Plato's work. So when one reads that Atlantis came to Plato via Solon in Egypt, one recognizes in it less a chain of historical facts than a symbolic bridge between worlds, between the realm of divine order and the transient world of men. And exactly there, at this fault line between myth and reality, the image of the island begins to take shape, with landscapes, palaces, and canals that seem to turn from words to stone. So the next section leads us to where philosophy becomes architecture, into the detailed description of Atlantis itself, that city of rings, water, and light. In Plato's imagination, Atlantis rose from the sea like a vast, luminous arc, an island whose beauty was so perfect that even the gods viewed it with wonder. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, the philosopher draws a picture of impressive precision, a landscape stretching from the sea to high mountains, traversed by fertile plains and gentle valleys, with a mild climate, rich flora, and countless animals. But the true heart of the empire lay in its capital, a city laid out in concentric rings of land and water, so symmetrical and harmonious that it seemed to stem from an idea rather than reality. Plato describes how the sea god Poseidon loved a mortal woman named Cleito, and for her protection, surrounded a hill with 3 rings of water and 2 of land. From this mythical gesture arose the form of the city, a symbol of divine order and human craftsmanship simultaneously. Bridges connected the individual rings, canals led to the sea, and on the central island rose the temple of Poseidon, a structure of silver, gold, and a metal plateau called Orichalcum. Orichalcum, the mountain copper, was considered the second most precious metal after gold. Archaeologically, it could have been an alloy of copper and zinc or copper and tin, an early form of brass or bronze. Its mention by Plato suggests that the philosopher wanted to emphasize the technological mastery and material wealth of Atlantis. For him, Orichalcum was not just a metal, but a symbol of splendor, power, and progress, those values that make a culture blossom but can also accelerate its downfall. The walls of the city are said to have shone in three colors: white, red, and black, matching the stone types of the island. The outer rings served trade and shipping, the middle one residential quarters, and the inner one was reserved for temples and palaces. Between the rings flowed canals where ships trafficked, guarded by towers and gates. This structure seems almost modern today, like an ancient vision of urban planning. Some researchers, including geographers and urban planners, see in Plato's description an astonishing premonition of later cities with functional zoning center, economy, defense. Furthermore, Plato speaks of a huge plain in the south of the island, of mountains in the north that protected the land from the storms of the ocean, and of a canal connecting the city to the sea. The soil was so fertile that it bore 2 harvests a year, fed by irrigation systems that collected rain in springs. In this depiction, mythological splendor and geographical realism combine, as if Plato wanted to create a utopia that appeared plausible at the same time. Although no archaeological proof confirms this world, something timeless reveals itself in Plato's vision: the longing for harmony between man, nature, and divine order. Atlantis was in its structure a geometric allegory: circles of water and earth, balance and movement, stability and change. And while we look at this city of words, whose walls perhaps never existed, we already sense the shadow that will soon swallow it, for no balance lasts forever. And so the next section leads us to the moment when this flawless order begins to break, to the history of the kings of Atlantis, and the path that leads from divine measure to human hubris. In Plato's narrative, Atlantis stands at the beginning as the embodiment of divine order. The kings of this empire were, it is said, the sons of Poseidon, born of the union with the mortal Cleito. 10 brothers ruled the land, each over his part of the island empire, yet all united by common laws their divine father had left them. This order was more than just administration. It was a moral foundation. The rulers were to govern justly, honor the gods, keep measure, and never war against one another. In this harmony between power and morality lay the glory of Atlantis. Yet Plato, who was deeply rooted in the crisis of his time, knew no empire remains steadfast forever when its values erode. Thus he depicts how over the generations, the divine nature of the kings weakened and the human nature became stronger. What once began as divine equilibrium slowly transformed into arrogance. The Atlanteans, satiated by wealth, forgot the modesty that had once lent them strength. Admiration turned to greed, knowledge to vanity, and order to a lust for domination. Plato describes this decay not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a moral drift, a movement that begins barely perceptibly until it becomes irreversible. The kings broke their promises, strove for power over foreign lands, wanted to extend their empire to Egypt and Italy. This hubris, as the Greeks called it, was for Plato the beginning of the end, the moment when humans cross divine boundaries. In Critias it says the gods gathered to judge the Atlanteans. Zeus, the guardian of justice and measure, decided to punish them, not out of anger, but out of necessity, to restore the cosmic balance. And so came the judgment: a storm, a quake, a flood. In one night and one day the island sank, and the sea swallowed what man had built with haughtiness. Behind this scene hides Plato's moral geometry. The downfall was no accident, no natural disaster, but the logical consequence of an ethical malfunction. Atlantis became the symbol of his philosophy. Virtue is the foundation of being, and whoever abandons this foundation brings about their own destruction. One also recognizes in this story an echo of Greek tragedy, that inevitable fate which occurs as soon as man violates the divine order. But Plato went further. For him Atlantis was not just a warning but a mirror. He wrote in a time when Athens, after the Peloponnesian War, was torn between corruption, greed for power, and political strife. The fall of Atlantis was thus also the shadow of Athens, a parable directed at his fellow citizens. So if the island vanishes in a day and a night, it is not by chance but by the principle that every civilization that loses measure destroys itself. This idea is timeless, for behind the myth hides a sober truth. No technical progress, no wealth, and no power can replace the lesson that arises when ethics crumble. And so this episode ends not only with the downfall of an empire, but with a question that echoes through the millennia: could our world, which considers itself invincible, one day share the same fate? But before we look at this reflection of the present, the next section leads us beyond the boundaries of philosophy to the places on Earth where people have been trying for centuries to find the real Atlantis. If Plato tells of Atlantis in Timaeus, a phrase drops that has occupied researchers, historians, and adventurers for millennia. Atlantis lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules. In these few words lies the key, or perhaps the veil, to one of the greatest riddles of human history. For what exactly did the philosopher mean by columns? And where did the gaze lead when one passed through them? In antiquity, the expression Pillars of Hercules was firmly anchored. It designated the two promontories marking the narrow strait between Europe and Africa, the Rock of Gibraltar on the side of the Iberian Peninsula, and Mount Jebel Musa in today's Morocco. For the Greeks, this was the end of the known world, a threshold between the familiar Mediterranean and the endless, mysterious ocean they called Atlantikos Pelagos. Whoever crossed this border entered the realm of the uncertain, the mythical. Plato wrote that beyond these pillars lay a large island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, from which one could reach other islands and finally the opposite continent. This description was so vague, and yet so powerful that it has since spawned countless theories. Some saw in it the Azores, others Madeira or the Canaries. Still others sought it in the Atlantic itself, in the Caribbean, yes, even in the North Sea. The problem is that Plato left neither scales nor coordinates. His words are a poetic compass, not a nautical one, and so generations have tried to transform this metaphor into a map. Historians like Herodotus or Eratosthenes describe the world of the West more precisely, yet they too saw beyond Gibraltar only the Great Sea. Only Roman geographers like Pomponius Mela or Pliny the Elder gave shape to the Atlantic, but not the island Plato mentioned. Many modern researchers therefore interpret the expression, beyond the pillars, not literally, but symbolically. For them, it marks the transition from the known to the unknown, from the visible to the remembered. Atlantis could thus be no place on the map, but a spiritual territory, an allegory for the crossing of human limits. But there are also those who take the myth seriously and try to prove it with geological, archaeological, and oceanographic means. To gain an overview, it is worth looking at the geography of possibilities. If one places Plato's descriptions, size, climate, vegetation, wealth, downfall by flood, side by side, an astonishing mosaic emerges. Santorini in the Aegean with its volcanic rings, the sunken Doggerland in the North Sea, the Azores far out in the Atlantic, the Richat structure in the Sahara with its concentric circles, or the Bimini Road in the Bahamas. Each of these places reflects a part of the narrative, yet none fits the whole picture. This blurriness is perhaps the secret of the myth's longevity. If Atlantis were clearly marked on a map, it would have long lost its magic, precisely because the clue, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, remains open. Every epoch can reinterpret it, as a challenge to the intellect and as a mirror of longing. And so, after we have crossed the threshold of these mythical pillars, the horizon opens to the many theories and landscapes that bear the name Atlantis. In the next section, we begin with the first of these traces on an island whose ash and sulfur perhaps formed the true foundation of the legend, Santorini and the downfall of Akrotiri. In the middle of the deep blue Aegean lies a crescent-shaped crater whose jagged cliffs look like scars from another time, Santorini. Whoever lets their gaze wander over the white houses and the glittering sea today hardly suspects that beneath these picturesque facades hides one of the greatest natural catastrophes in human history. About 3.5 millennia ago, between the 17th and 16th centuries BC, a massive volcanic eruption shook this island, which was then called Thera. The explosion was so strong that it reached large parts of the Mediterranean, changed the climate, and presumably became the setting of the memory that later reappeared as Atlantis in Plato's writings. In the southern part of the island lay Akrotiri, a blossoming city of the Minoan culture, whose roots reached to Crete. When archaeologists in the 20th century, among them the Greek researcher Spyridon Marinides, began to dig there, they found something that astonished the world. Streets, houses with multiple stories, finely decorated frescoes, ceramics, tools, and sewage systems. All this conserved under a thick layer of volcanic ash, similar to later Pompeii. But Akrotiri was much older, and it showed that a highly developed society already lived here in the second millennium BC, trading, creating art, and understanding the sea as a lifeline. The parallels to Plato's Atlantis are striking, even if they may seem like coincidence at first glance. An island culture, rich, technically advanced, with a clear urban structure, and a sudden downfall that destroyed it in a night. The explosion of the volcano, which according to modern estimates corresponded to the strength of several hundred atomic bombs, hurled ash and rock into the stratosphere. A gigantic tidal wave, a tsunami, hit the neighboring islands and the coasts of Crete, the center of the Minoans. With this began the decline of that civilization which had shaped the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. For historians and geologists, exactly therein lies the connection to Atlantis. Plato wrote his dialogues around 12 centuries later, in the 4th century BC. The story of the island empire that sank into the sea could be based on ancient memories of this catastrophe. Memories passed down in oral traditions over generations and finally mythologically exaggerated. Like Atlantis, Akrotiri was also a world where prosperity and nature stood in fragile balance, and where a single day sufficed to destroy everything. Despite the devastation, a quiet wonder remained. In Akrotiri, archaeologists found no human skeletons. This suggests that the inhabitants felt the first foreshocks and were able to flee in time. They left their city in perfect order, as if time had been stopped. Today their frescoes, dolphins, flowers, processions, are a poetic proof that beauty and downfall often go hand in hand. When walking through the dusty corridors of Akrotiri, one feels how past and present touch. Perhaps it was exactly this echo that inspired Plato, not as a chronicler, but as a philosopher who recognized in the dust of past empires the moral lesson of transience. And so the trail leads us from Santorini further out, across the Aegean, through the Strait of Gibraltar to the threshold of the Atlantic, where another clue waits. The sunken island at Cape Spartel in the shadow of the Moroccan coast. Where the Mediterranean opens and pours into the vast Atlantic lies a threshold that has been considered the border between the known and the unknown since antiquity. The Strait of Gibraltar. Between the rocks the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules, two worlds meet. The calm inland sea and the tempestuous ocean. Exactly here, west of the Moroccan coast, a place hides beneath the waves that has become one of the most credible candidates for the historical Atlantis for many researchers, the so-called Spartel or Magellan Bank. Today it lies at a depth of around 60 meters, covered by sand, currents, and millennia-old sediments. But according to the findings of modern geologists during the last ice age, it was a small island or archipelago that stood above sea level. Back then, about 12,000 years ago, meaning at the end of the Pleistocene, global sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than today due to the massive ice masses at the poles. As the Earth warmed and the ice began to melt, the water rose slowly but inexorably. And so Spartel disappeared too, piece by piece, until only the sand ridge remained that one can see on satellite maps today. The French geologist Jacques Collina Girard was one of the first to point to this trace in 2001. In a study, he argued that Plato's description fit this region astonishingly well. An island west of the Pillars of Hercules, rich in fertile land, which finally sank through a massive earthquake and a flood catastrophe. According to his calculation, strong seismic activities in the western Mediterranean at that time could have frequently changed the coastline and triggered tsunamis that flooded entire tracts of land. Kalina Gerard's hypothesis relies not on myths, but on geological data. Drill cores from the seafloor show that the Spartel Bank lay above water well into the late Ice Age. In connection with the global climate changes around the 10th millennium BC, its downfall could indeed have lived on in the collective memory of early civilizations, especially Egypt, whose cultural memory reaches back into mythical times, could have preserved fragments of this catastrophe. Those stories, then, that later came to Solon and Plato's ears. Of course, this theory also remains not undisputed. There are so far no archaeological finds proving human settlement of the Spartel Bank. Neither tools nor ruins were discovered, and the depth of the current sea makes investigations difficult. Nevertheless, the logic of the location convinces many researchers. A real place, geologically plausible geographically where Plato located it, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. If one imagines how a small island chain once towered over the waves there, surrounded by waters rich in fish and crisscrossed by merchant ships, then one understands why this theory possesses such poetic power. Perhaps it was not Atlantis itself, but the real seed from which the myth grew, a memory of the transition from a world of ice fields to the world of the seas. So Spartel remains a symbol, a place between reality and memory, between geology and legend, exactly at that threshold the ancients saw as the edge of the world. And from here, from the gate of the Atlantic, the view opens further west, beyond the endless ocean, to the islands of the Azores, which some hold to be the last peaks of the sunken continent. Far out in the Atlantic, more than 300 kilometers west of Lisbon, 9 green islands rise from the depths of the ocean, the Azores. They seem peaceful with their pastures, volcanic craters, and mist-shrouded mountains. Yet their origin is deeply dramatic. The islands are the visible result of massive tectonic forces where 3 continental plates, the North American, the Eurasian, and the African, collide. If one looks over the horizon of the islands, it is not hard to imagine that these are perhaps the last peaks of a land long sunk, a relic of that legendary continent Plato called Atlantis. The idea that the Azores could be the remnants of an old world appeared in the 19th century. The American congressman and writer Ignatius Donnelly published his famous work Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, in 1882. In it, he posited the thesis that an entire continent had sunk in the Atlantic, and that the Azores projected from the sea as the highest mountains of this sunken landmass. Donnelly combined geological, mythological, and linguistic clues into a theory that found great resonance at the time, an era when science did not yet possess precise knowledge of crustal movements. Later, the French geologist Pierre-Marie Termier also took up this idea. He was convinced that the Azores were the debris of an old continent destroyed by seismic catastrophes. For him, Plato's details fit astonishingly well. West of the Pillars of Hercules, in the middle of the Atlantic, a land of great extent that vanished in a short time. However, with the progress of geosciences in the 20th century, the picture began to change. The American paleontologist Charles Schuchart refuted Termier's assumptions and pointed out that the Azores are of purely volcanic origin, without any trace of continental crust. Their steep underwater slopes showed that they grew directly from the ocean floor and are not remains of an old mainland. Modern investigations confirm this view. The Azores are volcanic islands created along the so-called Azores Plateau, a complex geological border area between the Great Plate movements. Underwater lie no traces of sunken cities or structures, but lava flows and basalt formations, the product of millennia of eruptions. Nevertheless, the thought remains fascinating that these islands with their craters and caves could preserve the memory of an earlier forgotten world. In a mythological sense, the Azores fulfill exactly that role described by Plato. They lie in the west, beyond the known world, on the threshold between reality and legend. Their mysterious beauty and geological youth lend them an air of timelessness, as if they had stored the history of a sunken empire in their roots. Perhaps it is exactly this mixture of natural force and poetic symbolism that repeatedly moves the Azores into the vicinity of Atlantis. For while science soberly explains that they were born of fire and pressure, the heart speaks another language, the language of longing for the lost. But the Atlantic harbors still more riddles. If one follows the gaze from the Azores further south, a new trail appears. A group of islands equally linked with the legend and whose origin is equally mysterious. They are the Canary Islands, Madeira, and Cape Verde, the next candidates in the search for the lost Atlantis, deep in the heart of the Mauritanian Sahara, where the wind sweeps over endless seas of sand and the sun's light makes the horizon shimmer, hides one of the strangest formations on our planet, the Richat structure, reverently called the Eye of the Sahara by many. From close up, one sees only hills, ridges of rock, and dried-up plains. But from space, a different image unfolds. A massive circle of concentric rings, over 40 kilometers in diameter, appearing burned into the desert like an ancient eye. This structure was described in more detail in the 1950s by geologists like Theodore Monod. At first, it was thought to be the crater of a meteorite impact, so perfect was its roundness, so symmetrical its form. But later investigations, primarily by researchers from the Geological Survey of Canada and NASA, showed that no traces of melted rock or shock metamorphism were present, typical indicators of an impact. Instead, a different picture emerged. The Richat structure is the result of millions of years of geological activity, a massive eroded dumb mountain whose layers were exposed by wind and rain until they formed these concentric patterns. And yet, since satellite images made the eye visible, it has become a magnet for Atlantis theories. At first glance, it seems to follow Plato's description, concentric rings of land and water, a circular structure in the middle of a once fertile region of North Africa. Some researchers, including the YouTube channel Bright Insight, Jimmy Corsetti, point out that the dimensions of the Richat structure lie in remarkable proximity to the measurements Plato named in his Critias. They also point out that the Sahara in the late Ice Age was by no means a desert, but a green water, rich land with rivers, lakes, and savannas. If Atlantis thus once lay on the African continent, then this place would be at least geographically possible. However, academic science remains cautious. There are no archaeological traces of human settlements, no tools, no walls, no remains of an ancient city. Geochemical analyses indicate that the Richat structure is around 100 million years old, created long before the appearance of modern humans. Furthermore, its round form is no indication of human planning, but the result of geological layering and erosion. Nevertheless, one cannot deny that the Richat structure exerts an almost mythical fascination. When viewing it from above, one recognizes not only rock but a symbol, a circle in the void, an eye that has remained open over the millennia. Perhaps its attraction lies precisely therein. It is no proof of Atlantis, but an invitation to think about why we want to see the imprint of a lost civilization in every perfect form. Like the sea Plato described, the Sahara also seems to preserve its memory, not in water but in stone. The Eye of the Sahara is less the window to Atlantis than a reflection of our longing for order in chaos, for meaning in the vastness. And so the journey leads us further from the sand deserts of Africa out across the Atlantic, where under a tropical sun another enigmatic formation awaits us, the Bimini Road of the Bahamas, interpreted by some as the paved road to Atlantis. Off the west coast of the Bahamian island of Bimini, where the Caribbean Sea glows in all shades from turquoise to emerald, lies a mysterious mosaic of rectangular stone blocks. At a depth of about 6 meters stretches an almost straight formation, around 800 meters long, as if someone had once built a road leading into nowhere. This so-called Bimini Road was discovered in 1968 and has since become one of the most discussed underwater phenomena in the world. Divers report that the huge stone slabs, some up to 4 meters wide, look like paving stones set upon one another. The regular form, the clear edges, the seemingly planned pattern. All this immediately arouses the suspicion of human hands. Many saw in it the proof that a civilization existed here, blossoming long before our known history, and then swallowed by the sea. And because this archipelago lies on the western edge of the Atlantic, the connection to Atlantis was quickly drawn. One of the first to publicly advocate this idea was the American psychic Edgar Cayce. Decades before the discovery, he had prophesied in trance readings that the remains of Atlantis would emerge off the coast of Bimini around the year 1968. When divers actually found the stone row in that very year, his vision seemed to be fulfilled in a wondrous way. Consequently, adventurers, authors, and self-proclaimed researchers flocked to the region, convinced they were witnesses to one of the greatest archaeological breakthroughs of all time. But science soon brought disillusionment. Geologists like Eugene Shin and Marshall McCusick examined the structure thoroughly and came to a different conclusion. The road, they explained, consists of so-called beak rock, a naturally formed sedimentary rock type that forms in warm, shallow coastal waters. Through chemical processes, the sand solidifies on the seabed into stone slabs, which later break through waves, currents, and tectonic movements, often along straight lines. Wind and water grind the fracture edges until they look almost geometric. The result, a natural formation that looks so ordered that the eye recognizes intention in it. Despite this sober explanation, the fascination remains. Perhaps because the Bimini Road acts like a poetic symbol, a road underwater leading to a lost world. Even skeptical scientists admit that its site has something sublime. It is as if one were looking at the bottom of a myth, not with the eyes of the researcher, but with those of a dreamer. Comparing the Bimini Road with other formations like the alleged underwater structures of Yonaguni in Japan or the basalt columns of Iceland, one recognizes that nature itself produces the best architects. But while geologists explain patterns in rock, people seek stories in them, and perhaps exactly therein lies the essence of Atlantis, not in stone or metal, but in the way we try to bring order and meaning into the chaos of the world. So the Bimini Road, whether a work of nature or a relic of a forgotten epoch, remains a silent monument beneath the waves, a place where science and legend meet. And while the sun dips over the ocean, the next stage of our journey leads us back to Europe, to the banks of the Guadalquivir, to where the mythical city of Tartessos once flourished and could be for many the true origin of the Atlantis myth, where the Guadalquivir flows sluggishly through the plains of Andalusia and finally pours into the Atlantic. A kingdom is said to have once existed that the Greeks called Tartessos, a civilization rich in gold, silver, and tin, with harbors full of ships and temples dedicated to the sun god. Today this land has disappeared. A name remains a whisper in the chronicles, and yet the landscape around Huelva, Cadiz, and Seville still bears traces of this forgotten empire. Some researchers even believe that here, at the westernmost edge of the ancient world, could lie the historical foundation for Plato's Atlantis myth. The oldest clues to Tartessos come from the 9th to 7th century BC. Archaeological finds show that the region was a significant trading center where the cultures of the Mediterranean met the Phoenicians from the east, the Celts from the north, and the local tribes. The Greek historian Herodotus described Tartessos as an empire that experienced great prosperity under King Arganthonios, whose name means the Silver One. He is said to have ruled over 80 years and even welcomed Greeks from Phocaea who traded there. This wealth was no accident. The land between the Atlantic and the fertile valleys of the Guadalquivir possessed huge ore deposits, copper, silver, and tin, that were already exploited in the Bronze Age. From here, metals reached the entire Mediterranean world via Phoenician traders as far as Carthage and Tyre. The rivers served as natural trade routes, and at their mouths arose cities with advanced architecture, fortified walls, and developed craftsmanship. Frescoes, jewelry, and ceramics found in the region show a mixture of Oriental style and local symbolism, a proof that Tartessos was a melting pot. But as with Atlantis, the splendor ended abruptly. Around the middle of the 6th century BC, Tartessos disappeared from written sources. Historians suspect that the expansion of the Carthaginians, striving for control over the western trade routes, brought about the end of the empire. Perhaps they destroyed its cities. Perhaps changes in the course of the Guadalquivir River also caused the harbors to silt up and trade to extinguish. Just as with Plato, the downfall was understood not merely as a historical event, but as a moral parable. An empire that lost itself in wealth and power fell to silence. In recent decades, excavations near Huelva, Dota Blanca, and El Carambolo have provided new clues. Temple remains, altars, golden jewelry indicating that Tartessos was no fable, but a real high culture. Its heyday, its location, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and its sudden decline make it one of the most plausible historical models for Atlantis. So Tartessos could be the bridge between myth and history, a place where Plato's ideas met reality. For here in the sun, land of Andalusia, the glitter of metal, the splendor of past temples, and the echo of a culture that, like Atlantis, was swallowed by the tides of time unite. And yet our trail does not end at the Guadalquivir. If one follows the map of myths further north and east, one encounters other places that have equally fallen into oblivion, sunken lands that once connected Europe before the sea covered them forever, Doggerland and the northern plains of prehistory. Between the coasts of England, the Netherlands, and Denmark lies a rough sea today, whose waves roll incessantly over shallows that fishermen call Dogger Bank. Yet deep beneath these waters rests another world, a lost land that once bore forests, rivers, lakes, and wide plains. Doggerland, as modern archaeology calls it, was no sea in the last ice age, but a fertile, inhabited area connecting large parts of the present North Sea basin. It was the heart of Europe long before the sea assumed its dominion, and perhaps one of those real examples where memory and the myth of Atlantis touch. About 20,000 years ago, when ice still covered large parts of northern Europe, the sea level was more than 120 meters lower than today. The coastline ran far beyond today's borders, and where the sea spreads today, a huge plain stretched connecting Great Britain with the European mainland. Rivers like the Thames, the Elbe, and the Rhine Meuse, Scheldt united into a mighty stream system flowing into the Atlantic. In this water-rich landscape lived humans, hunter-gatherers moving through forests, hunting reindeer, and settling in small communities. With the end of the Ice Age, about 10,000 years BC, the slow but relentless rise of the sea level began. Millennium after millennium the water advanced, flooded valleys and lakes, and transformed floodplains into coasts. By 7000 BC, Doggerland had already become an island, and only a few centuries later it disappeared completely beneath the waves of the North Sea. It was no catastrophe in one night as with Plato, but a quiet, creeping sinking that generations experienced and passed down. Perhaps exactly these memories of the sinking land, of the floods swallowing villages and forests, later echoed in the myths of Europe as stories of empires swallowed by the sea. The existence of Doggerland was rediscovered only in the 20th century by chance. Fishermen pulled ancient bones of mammoths, reindeer, and even tool fragments from their nets. Later, geological drillings and underwater scan data confirmed that an extensive landscape had indeed existed there. Modern investigations with sonar and sediment analysis show that Doggerland was rich in freshwater lakes and wetlands, a paradise amidst the cold north. Doggerland is today a key to our understanding of early human history in Europe. It proves that landmasses can disappear, that civilizations, however small they may have been, are wiped out by the forces of nature. In this sense, Doggerland mirrors a truth pointing beyond the myth of Atlantis. The change of the earth is inevitable, and the traces of human life are fragile, like sand on the shore. If one imagines the map of the world back then, one sees that Doggerland acted like a bridge between the people of the continent and the island of Great Britain, a bridge the sea finally tore away. Perhaps this is also a deeper lesson such stories convey to us, that separation and connection, loss and memory are part of a single cycle. And while the North Sea keeps its secret, the next trace of the myth leads us further east to the coasts of Anatolia, where in the depths of history another candidate for the lost Atlantis is suspected, the city of Izmir and the Aegean of early civilizations. In the extreme southwest of Japan, near the Ryukyu archipelago, where the Pacific meets the East China Sea, lies the small island of Yonaguni, a wind-battered isle known for its steep cliffs, its diver's paradise, and a riddle that has occupied science and fantasy alike for decades. In the mid-1980s, the Japanese diver Keiichiro Aratake discovered a massive stepped structure of solid stone blocks off the coast of the island, appearing to rise from the sea floor like a pyramid. Its sight was so impressive that it was soon designated the Japanese Atlantis. At a depth of about 25 meters extends a massive formation of sandstone, over 100 meters long and 50 meters wide. It consists of wide, flat terraces, rectangular blocks, sharp edges, and seemingly perfect steps. Some sections look like stairs, others like platforms or corridors. Very early on, many believed this was not a product of nature, but the remains of an ancient city sunken in the sea. Researchers like the marine geologist Masaki Kimura from the University of the Ryukyu investigated the site over decades and concluded that certain features, particularly smooth surfaces, right-angled lines, and horizontal carvings, could indicate human workmanship. Kimura dated the alleged site to an age of at least 10,000 years, meaning into the time after the end of the last ice age, when the sea level rose significantly. He suspected that Yonaguni could have been part of a larger, today sunken landmass that once connected southern Japan with Taiwan. According to his hypothesis, an early civilization could have lived there whose knowledge is long lost. An echo of those cultures that Plato might have described as the origin of Atlantis. However, the majority of science views this interpretation skeptically. Investigations by the Geological Society of Japan revealed that the rocks of Yonaguni consist of layered sandstone that has decayed into regular blocks through tectonic forces and erosion over millennia. Archaeologist Richard Schoch points out that the clear lines and right-angled forms are attributable to natural fractures. Similar structures are also found on land, for instance in the basalt formations in Iceland or the cliffs of Oshima. Even the supposed carvings could be the result of currents and sediment movement. This debate makes Yonaguni a fascinating mirror of human perception, for between the wish to find an ancient secret and the sober reality of geological processes lies a space only imagination can bridge. Perhaps the underwater pyramid is thus no relic of a forgotten culture, but a monument to the way we humans create stories by recognizing our own image in the forms of nature. And yet, when diving down, when the sun's rays break through the water and the stepped blocks shine in golden light, the border between myth and reality seems to blur. Yonaguni remains a place where one can feel how close legend and science sometimes come. From the silent depths of the Pacific, the next trail leads us back to the deserts of Africa, to a structure also resting in concentric rings and designated by some as the true center of Atlantis, the Eye of the Sahara in Mauritania. After following the traces across seas and continents, from the ash islands of Santorini to the depths of the Bahamas, from the dunes of the Sahara to the green cliffs of the Azores, a question remains at the end, unchanged for millennia. Which of these hypotheses withstands scrutiny when placed next to Plato's own words? To understand this, one must read the philosopher himself, not as a poet, but as the architect of a parable. In Timaeus and Critias, Plato describes Atlantis as an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, with concentric rings of land and water, a mild climate, fertile soil, a technically advanced society, and a downfall in a night and a day through earthquakes and floods. If one places these features like a mental map on the table, a pattern of agreement and contradiction emerges. Let us begin with Santorini and Akrotiri. It lies within the Aegean and not beyond Gibraltar, yet the parallel in destruction is unmistakable. a sudden catastrophic downfall triggered by a volcanic explosion that shrouded its culture in ash. This fits astonishingly well with the Platonic image of a night of terror. It's disadvantaged geographically, too close to Greece, too small for a world empire. The Spartel or Magellan Bank fulfills the topographical condition west of the Pillars of Hercules, and geologically it was demonstrably above water during the last ice age. But here the cultural element is missing. No traces of human settlements, no artifacts, no sign of a high civilization. It is the right stage, but without actors. The Azores seem in turn made for the myth far out in the Atlantic, an archipelago halfway between Europe and America, formed of fire and sea. But modern geology disenchants this romance. The islands consist of young volcanic rock, no trace of a sunken continent. Their beauty remains, their age does not. The eye of the Sahara with its concentric rings perhaps awakens the strongest feeling of having found Atlantis. Form, size, and arrangement resemble Plato's description amazingly. But geology contradicts here too. The Richat structure is a natural phenomenon created millions of years ago, long before humans lived there. No sea surrounded it, no city stood upon it. Similar applies to the Bimini Road and Yonaguni. Their geometric forms seem artificial, but they are the result of natural processes. Erosion, pressure, sedimentation. They fit Plato's pattern of symmetry, but not his timeline or his moral narrative. Looking at all these theories side by side, it shows none of them fulfills all conditions. Some match geographically, others geologically, some symbolically. But none carries the entire story, and perhaps that is exactly the point. Atlantis was never intended to be fully found. Plato created it as a moral mirror image, as a parable for the hubris of humanity, not as a nautical chart for adventurers. Yet this does not mean the search is in vain, for each of these hypotheses reveals something else. Santorini shows us the power of nature, Spartel the fragility of memory, the Azores the dream of lost continents, the Sahara the geometry of the earth itself. Together they result in a mosaic, no proof, but a narrative about our longing to understand the past. And so this round of theories ends not with a period, but with a comma. For beyond the question of where Atlantis lay, stands a larger one: why we search for it at all. To answer this, we must detach our gaze from the maps and direct it to those civilizations that actually existed, empires that blossomed and passed like Atlantis, whose ruins we can still touch today. If one lays all the traces and theories about Atlantis side by side, an astonishing pattern emerges, not of stones and walls, but of principles. Behind every sunken city, behind every vanished empire, stands the same silent logic. The rise begins with order, with belief in something higher, with measure and harmony. But the decline follows as soon as this balance breaks. As soon as excess becomes habit and power an end in itself. This formula repeats through history like a heartbeat, sometimes quiet, sometimes catastrophically loud. Think of Santorini, an island that once bloomed through trade and culture, until it was swallowed by the force of the earth itself. The Minoans, wealthy and artistic, lost in a moment what they had built over centuries. A warning example that even the most beautiful progress stands on unstable ground. Or of Pompeii, buried under the ash of Vesuvius, a city whose frescoes still tell of enjoyment and wealth, while its inhabitants saw the sky darken in the final seconds. In both cases, not man, but the unpredictability of nature stood at the beginning of the end, and yet a moral chord resonates here too. Man builds as if his world were eternal and forgets that it rests on liquid fire. It was different in Angkor, Petra, or Teotihuacan, where the downfall did not come suddenly, but slowly over generations. Here it was not nature, but man himself who destroyed the balance through war, overpopulation, exploitation, and crisis of faith. The Khmer in Cambodia built a water system that functioned for centuries until droughts and political divisions brought it to collapse. In the desert of Jordan, Petra lost its trade routes and was struck by earthquakes. While in Mexico, Teotihuacan, once a metropolis of over 100,000 people, perished in hunger, unrest, and fire. The rhythm is always the same. Overextension follows the blossom, exhaustion follows greatness. These parallels make understandable why Plato's story seems so universal. He invented no island, but condensed a recurring pattern of civilizations into a single metaphor. Atlantis was for him the symbol of this dynamic, the moment when technological power and moral decay meet. And perhaps exactly that is the reason why the myth remains so alive. It tells less of a place than of an attitude, of how easily man can transform his creation into destruction when he loses measure. Looking at all these empires, whether real or mythical, one recognizes that their downfall was never final. Knowledge lives on in the ruins, memory in the myths, hope in the art. Every collapse leaves seeds for a new beginning. The dust of Pompeii became the library of archaeology, the stones of Angkor the symbol of cultural resilience, and the story of Atlantis a warning that wisdom lasts longer than power. So the circle closes from splendor to ash, from ash to insight. The patterns are clear, yet the lesson is open. It depends on whether we listen. And with that, the gate opens to the next chapter of our journey to those real cities and empires that actually went under, whose walls still testify to the hand of man today. Pompeii, Angkor, Petra, and the many others in which the myth of Atlantis lives on. At a late summer day in the year 79 AD, the sky over the Bay of Naples was clear, the sea calm, the markets lively. In the streets of Pompeii, it smelled of bread and olives. Children played between marble columns, and in the baths men talked of politics and gladiators. No one suspected that the earth beneath their feet had long been trembling, that Vesuvius, that seemingly sleeping mountain, carried within it a fire that would soon swallow a whole world. On the morning of August 24 the inferno began. A massive explosion hurled a cloud of ash and gas kilometers high into the sky. It spread like a dark mushroom over the sun, darkened the day, and turned it into an eerie night. For hours, fine ash rained on the roofs and streets, filled wells and courtyards until it finally buried everything beneath it. People sought refuge, some in cellars, others in temples, but Vesuvius was merciless. Around midnight, pyroclastic flows broke loose, a deadly mixture of glowing ash, gas, and rock, sweeping through the city at the speed of a storm. Within a few moments, thousands of lives were extinguished. Somewhat further north in Herculaneum, the fate was similar, but the image different. Here the bodies were not covered by ash, but by a flood of mud and lava that poured into the alleys and sealed everything beneath it. Houses, frescoes, and even wooden structures remained preserved in a state still breathtaking today, frozen in the moment of catastrophe. Only many centuries later, in the 16th century, were the remains accidentally discovered when walls and frescoes were encountered during canal construction. But it was the Spanish engineer Orichalcum de Alcubierre who began systematic excavations in the 18th century. What he uncovered was no field of ruins, but a time capsule. Bread crusted in the oven, paintings with scenes of everyday life, plaster casts of bodies in their final pose, testimonies of a life that extinguished in the fraction of a moment yet never fully passed. Pompeii and Herculaneum are today far more than archaeological sites. They are mirrors of a civilization astonishingly modern in art, technology, and comfort. Streets with curbs, graffiti on the walls, murals telling of beauty and passion. All this shows that the Romans, for all their power, were deeply human. And exactly here lies their proximity to Plato's Atlantis. The thought that even the mightiest culture succumbs to nature in a moment, that abundance and progress are no guarantee for eternity. When walking through the silent streets of Pompeii, between houses silent for almost 2,000 years, one feels this echo. Every wall tells of everyday life and of transience. Just as Atlantis vanished in a night, Pompeii also became a symbol, not only of downfall but of memory. And while Vesuvius still watches over the bay, the trail of fire leads us further east into the tropical forests of Southeast Asia, where another city of stone and faith succumbed to the passage of time. The lost Angkor, the heart of the ancient Khmer Empire, deep in the heart of Southeast Asia, where the land breathes in the change of seasons, between monsoon-soaked fields and sun-scorched earth. Once lay one of the greatest metropolises of human history, Angkor, the capital of the Khmer Empire. Today its temples are embraced by roots, its stone covered in moss. But whoever strides through the silent corridors of Angkor Wat still feels the pulse of an empire that lived by water for centuries and broke upon it. The rise of the Khmer began in the 9th century AD. Under King Jayavarman II, the empire united into a power reaching from the Tonle Sap to the coasts of today's Vietnam. Water was the soul of this empire. The Khmer mastered the art of hydraulics like few other cultures of their time. They built canals, dams, and huge water reservoirs, the barrages, to store the rain floods of the monsoon and irrigate the land during the dry season. This complex system transformed Angkor into the Venice of the jungle, a city of stone and mirrors where temples reflected in the water, and every season was part of a precise balance. But precisely this balance was to become destiny. In the 12th century, at the time of King Suryavarman II, the empire reached its zenith. The gigantic temple complex of Angkor Wat arose not only as a religious structure, but as a symbol of cosmic order. The towers represented the peaks of the mythological Mount Meru, the center of the universe, while the moats symbolized the cosmic ocean. Religion, power, and technology flowed together in a single work. But behind this splendor, cracks began to show. Invisible at first, but unstoppable. From the 14th century, climate patterns shifted. Months-long droughts alternated with torrential rains that destroyed canals and flooded fields. The once finely tuned water system collapsed. Without regular harvests, the economic and social fabric began to break. Simultaneously, external threats grew. The Siamese from Ayutthaya pushed from the east, while internal power struggles weakened the unity of the empire. Religious upheavals from Hinduism to Mahayana and later Theravada Buddhism also left their traces. Old temples were abandoned, new ones built, and the spiritual center shifted ever further. Finally, in the 15th century, Angkor fell silent. The jungle took back what humans had once created. Roots burst walls, vines embraced statues, and the city that once housed hundreds of thousands disappeared into silence. Only French researchers of the 19th century like Henri Mohat brought it back to light and recognized its magnitude. Larger than medieval Paris, with a water system whose precision still astonishes today. Angkor is the Asian echo of Atlantis, a civilization that broke on its own greatness. Its downfall was no divine wrath, but the consequence of a disturbed balance between man and nature, progress and measure. And so the journey leads us from the tropical plains of Cambodia to the arid valleys of Jordan to Petra, the city of stone growing from the desert and perishing in beauty and silence like Angkor. Between the red cliffs of the Jordanian desert, where the sun dips the rock in gold and purple, lies a city that seems hewn from a dream, Petra, the city of stone. Hidden behind a narrow gorge, the famous Sikh, the view suddenly opens after a long walk to what has astonished travelers for centuries. The Fakat of Al-Khazni, the treasury. It seems born from the rock itself. Majestic, silent, eternal. But Petra was not always a place of silence. Once it was the heart of a trading empire controlling the desert roads of Arabia and steering the fate of entire empires. The story begins in the 6th century BC when an Arab people, the Nabateans, moved into this inhospitable region. They were nomads, traders, and master builders at once, people who knew how to tame water where hardly any rain fell. With ingenious engineering, they cut cisterns, canals, and storage basins into the stone, collecting the rainwater of the winter months and supplying the city all year round. This ability made Petra an oasis of power. From here, the Nabateans controlled the caravan routes bringing frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silk from Arabia and India to Syria, Egypt, and Rome. In the 1st century BC, Petra experienced its heyday. Under King Aretas IV, it became the glittering capital of an empire gaining wealth not through war, but through trade. Its temples, theaters, tombs, and palaces carved directly into the rock reflected this prosperity. The architecture reveals the influence of many cultures, Hellenistic columns beside Oriental arches, a visible sign that Petra was a junction of civilizations. Here east met west, and the silence of the desert was traversed by the calls of traders in dozens of languages. But as with Atlantis and Angkor, the seed of downfall lay in the change of time. When the Roman Empire extended its power to Arabia in the 2nd century AD, Petra increasingly came under Roman influence. Initially, trade continued to bloom, but with the opening of new sea routes along the Red Sea, the caravan routes lost their importance. The paths of wealth changed, and with them the fate of the city. A heavy earthquake in the 4th century destroyed large parts of the infrastructure, and although the Romans partially rebuilt it, Petra never returned to former greatness. In the Byzantine era, it transformed into a small Christian center before falling completely into oblivion in the 12th century. When the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt rediscovered it in 1812, Petra was already a myth. The Bedouins called it the Lost City, and its stone facades had become monuments to transients. Today, Petra stands on the list of UNESCO World Heritage and counts as one of the new 7 wonders of the world, not only because of its beauty, but because of the story it tells, that even stone passes when paths and times change. Petra is the stony Atlantis of the Middle East, not swallowed by the sea, but by sand and oblivion. Its downfall reminds us that civilizations disappear not only through catastrophes but also through creeping change. And so we continue the journey, further across the Atlantic to another city lying like a riddle in the mist of time. Teotihuacan, the city where men became gods. About 50 kilometers northeast of today's Mexico City stretches a plain that was once the center of one of the greatest metropolises of the ancient world. Between the wide hill ranges rises the massive Pyramid of the Sun, flanked by the smaller Pyramid of the Moon and the long Avenue of the Dead. The heart of Teotihuacan, the city where men became gods. Today visitors wander reverently through these stony veins of a sunken civilization, but nearly 2,000 years ago, this was a pulsing world, populated by hundreds of thousands, permeated by smoke, song, and the scent of burnt copal. The origins of Teotihuacan reach into the 2nd century BC, yet it experienced its greatest bloom between the 2nd and 6th centuries AD. In that time it was a center of power, culture, and religion, a place creating its own cosmic order. Its streets followed an exact plan aligned with the stars. Its temples were not mere buildings, but replicas of the universe. The Pyramid of the Sun symbolized creation, the Pyramid of the Moon the afterlife, and the Temple of the Feathered Serpent Quetzalcoatl united life and death in one breath. This precision shows an understanding of geometry, astronomy, and faith far ahead of its time. But greatness had its price. Teotihuacan grew rapidly to over 100,000. Some researchers say 200,000 inhabitants. Such a population demanded food, water, order. The fields in the surrounding valleys were fed by a sophisticated irrigation system. But this system depended entirely on one factor: rain. And sometime in the 7th century AD, the rain stayed away. Archaeological investigations show that the region was haunted by heavy droughts over several decades. Rivers dried up, harvests collapsed, and the once divine balance crumbled. But not only nature, people too contributed to the decline. With scarcity came tensions between the elites living in magnificent palaces and the population suffering hunger. There are indications of uprisings, fire, and destruction. Entire districts were burned down, temples desecrated. Perhaps it was no single day, but a creeping decay leading the city into darkness. Around the year 650 AD, Teotihuacan was largely abandoned. Only wind and lizards roamed the streets where sacrificial ceremonies were once celebrated and god images worshipped. Later cultures like the Toltecs and Aztecs found the ruins centuries later. They were convinced that here the gods themselves had once touched the sky, hence the name Teotihuacan. For them, this place was no relic, but a holy mirror, a memorial that even divine cities die when the balance of man and nature breaks. The history of Teotihuacan is an echo of Plato's. Here too, a civilization shining in technical art and spiritual depth, but breaking under its own weight. Where once the smoke of sacrifices rose, Only the silent steps of the pyramids remained, witnesses to the eternal cycle of rise and passing. And so the path leads us further east, deep into the rainforest of Central America, to the mysterious cities of the Maya, whose temples lay hidden in the thicket, and whose downfall poses riddles to this day. Deep in the dense jungle of Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, and Honduras, where howler monkeys jump through treetops and fog hangs like forgotten breaths between ruins, lie the remains of a civilization counting among the most complex in human history, the Maya. Their cities, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Calakmul, and countless others, were no mere settlements but stone forests amidst living forests, symphonies of pyramids, palaces, and temples built in perfect harmony with nature, at least in the beginning. The roots of Maya culture reach back into the second millennium BC. Yet their classic heyday began around the 3rd century AD and lasted into the 9th. In this time arose a network of city-states extending over hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Every city was a center of religion, astronomy, art, and science. Their script was the only fully developed writing system of pre-Columbian America. Their calendars calculated sun and moon cycles with astonishing precision, and their architects created structures still towering majestically from the jungle after over 1,000 years. But the greater the success, the more fragile the balance. The heart of the Maya Empire lay in a region geographically beautiful, but ecologically sensitive. Tropical, yet without large rivers, dependent on rain and careful handling of water and soil. To feed their growing population, the Maya cleared huge forest areas, laid out fields, canals, and reservoirs. Initially, the system worked surprisingly well. Agriculture flourished, cities grew, and temples became ever larger. But in the 8th and 9th centuries, the soil began to erode, sources dried up, and the climate changed. Archaeological sediment analysis show clear traces of long drought periods combining with overuse of the land, a combination that acted catastrophically. With the decline of harvests came the collapse of political order. The great city-states, once connected by alliances, began to fight each other. Palaces burned, kings were overthrown, and faith in the divine order, the foundation of their culture, crumbled. The inscriptions once telling of victories and rituals silenced one by one. Around the year 900 AD, many of the largest cities were abandoned. Only in some regions of the north like Chichen Itza and later Mayapan did the culture flicker up once more before finally fading into the mist of history. The end of the Maya was no sudden downfall like at Pompeii, but a quiet, multi-layered crumbling, an ecological, social, and spiritual collapse. Their world had become too big for the land feeding it. The forests they once called holy were overused, and the rain they trusted in stayed away. The Maya remind us that greatness lies not only in structures, but in the ability to live in balance with the earth. In this sense, they are a real reflection of Plato's Atlantis. Both warn of the hubris of a civilization believing it can control nature without understanding its rhythm. And so the last step of this journey leads us even deeper into the wilderness of the continent, into the Amazon basin, where archaeologists have only in recent decades begun to discover traces of further lost cities. Cities that might finally change the image of Atlantis. Deep in the green ocean of the Amazon, where mist hangs between giant trees and the hum of insects forms the only melody of the day, the earth slowly reveals one of its last great secrets. Under the seemingly endless vegetation of Ecuador in the Opano region, archaeologists found something in recent years that remained hidden for centuries. The remains of an extensive urban network, streets, plazas, terraces, irrigation systems, and settlements once housing tens of thousands of people. This discovery turns much of what was believed about the history of the Amazon on its head. For here in the heart of the rainforest, it appears that high cultures existed long before the first European conquerors spoke of an untouched wilderness. The exploration of these cities began earnestly in the 21st century when the Franco Ecuadorian team around Stephen Rostaine made the dense forest transparent with the help of LiDAR technology, a type of laser scan from the air. What they found was breathtaking, an urban system extending over hundreds of square kilometers with planned streets, rectangular platforms, ditches, and canals. It was no loose mesh of villages, but an organized world existing between 500 BC and 500 AD, roughly at the same time the Roman Empire blossomed in Europe. The people of Opano had understood the art of living with the rainforest, not against it. Their fields lay on elevated terraces to avoid flooding. Canals guided water where it was needed, and even in the dense vegetation, they created paths still recognizable as veins in the soil today. Unlike many classic civilizations, their strength was based not on stone, but on earth and plants. Their architecture consisted of organic materials that time decomposed, and precisely therefore they vanished from the view of history. This discovery has changed the image of the Amazon. Long considered a green desert unable to support large populations, the cities of Opano, just like finds in Bolivia and Brazil, prove the opposite. The rainforest was once a cultural mosaic of settlements connected by trade routes. It was no primitive wilderness, but a finely balanced ecosystem of man and nature in which knowledge, agriculture, and spirituality merged. Perhaps exactly that is the reason why many researchers today speak of the true Atlanteans, not because they literally sank in the sea, but because they were swallowed by time and the forest. Like Atlantis, they existed, then vanished without leaving traces in the chronicles of the world, until the science of the modern age made their shadows visible again. Opano reminds us that the myth of Atlantis is no story about a lost empire, but about what man forgets when nature reclaims its memory. Between roots and ferns, between earth and mist lie the lines of a chapter only now being read. And so the circle of this long journey closes from Plato's Atlantis to the lost cities of the Amazon, from the depths of the sea to the crowns of the trees, a journey asking less about a place than a truth, that every civilization, whether of stone or leaves, persists only as long as it maintains balance with the earth. When we stand at the end of this journey, from the halls of Plato to the forests of Amazonia, from the volcanic islands of the Aegean to the pyramids underwater, a quiet realization remains. Atlantis was never just a place. It was and is a mirror in which humanity's longing shows to understand the lost, to preserve the past, and to find meaning in the chaos of history. Plato told of an island that disappeared in a night and a day, but perhaps his Atlantis was less a warning against the gods than an invitation to reflect on ourselves, on those cycles of greatness and decay repeating for millennia. Every civilization we touched in this story, whether Santorini, Angkor, Teotihuacan, or the cities of the Amazon, was a shining proof of human creative power, and each disappeared when it lost the balance with itself, with measure. Perhaps the true lesson of Atlantis lies exactly therein, that no empire lasts forever, but no knowledge is ever fully lost. Under every forest, under every sea, in every legend slumbers an echo of our own history. We all carry Atlantis within us, in our memory, in our hubris, in our hope that from the past something new grows. So the next time you step into an old ruin, watch the sea, or simply smell the rain on the earth, remember every stone fragment, every wave, every drop is part of the same narrative, the great unfinished history of being human. And now it is your turn. What does Atlantis mean to you? Myth, warning, or hope? Write it in the comments below. I rate every line. If you enjoyed this journey, leave a subscription so you don't miss any of the coming expeditions into history. For the search for Atlantis does not end here. It begins in us. And somewhere between water and time, the next story is already waiting to be told.